78, the natural rate of unemployment. Now, just a word of warning here, when candidates learn the Phillips curve, they absolutely love it because it looks quite nice, doesn't it? And it tells policymakers you can have a choice between either having high inflation, low unemployment, or high unemployment and low inflation. And it's a dead easy to draw, and it's dead easy to understand, and it shows trade-offs. However, the Phillips curve was based upon data from 1861 to 1913, and then Phillips looked at that data and then looked at the period 1913 to 1957 and came up with the conclusion that there was in fact a Phillips curve at play. So therefore governments had a choice either between low unemployment, high inflation, or high inflation and low unemployment. However, I really think that is now out of date, and this is what Friedman is saying, because if you have really good supply side, it is in fact possible to achieve low unemployment and low inflation. And there have been loads of times in the British economy since 1957, well particularly since the 1980s really, of situations where unemployment has fallen and inflation has also fallen. However, there is a link, because as we get lower unemployment, those workers will probably ask for higher wages, and that probably will create higher inflation. But however, it's also possible to, through supply-side economics, to create a situation where we have low unemployment and also low inflation. And that's really, I think, what the long run Phillips curve is saying. Okay. So let's get started then. So here we've got the natural rate of unemployment. This is the old Phillips curve, what I call it. It appears in examinations all over the place. Candidates love drawing it out and saying there's a trade-off between the two. Even when the question's about the balance of payments, they always manage to bring in the Phillips curve, and then it is totally irrelevant. And there was a link between the two. So therefore we could have high inflation, low unemployment, or really low inflation, even deflation here, and high levels of unemployment. Okay, but the natural unemployment was put forward by Friedman, who says that the actual Phillips curve was vertical. The long run Phillips curve was certainly vertical. Sorry, the long run Phillips curve was vertical. Now, the natural rate of unemployment is made up of structural unemployment and also frictional unemployment. Now, the reason why those workers are unemployed is probably because they lack the skills or to move into new jobs. So therefore, if you give those who are structurally and frictionally unemployed, the right skills, then they will be able to find jobs. So for instance, structural employment is if a whole industry closes down, those workers have those skills for those industries, but therefore they then need to be retrained to find new skills so that they can find jobs in different areas. Unlike demand deficient unemployment, if you are cyclically unemployed or demand deficient unemployed, then you can just increase aggregate demand, and therefore those workers will have the skills, and so those workers will therefore find jobs again. Now, this is the natural rate of unemployment is part of monetarism, and there's three parts to monetarism that you need to remember. They believed in MV equals PT, so a direct link between the money supply and prices. They're also massive on supply side economics, and they believe that anything can be solved with the supply side economics, and I think that's really their main contribution towards economic policy decision making. And they also believe that the natural rate of unemployment occurs when the long run Phillips curve crosses the x-axis. Now, where the natural rate of unemployment is the definition of that is all those workers who are structurally and frictionally unemployed. Or another way of putting it is when the labour market is in equilibrium and where the labour supply is equal to labour demand. Right, we think that the natural rate of unemployment in the UK is probably at about 5%. Now that's a really important figure. So those 5% of people who are then unemployed are going to find it difficult to find jobs. Now, the reason why that is the case is because they lack the skills to find jobs, or they lack the information to find jobs, or they're going to have to move to find a job. So actually, if you can solve all of those issues, then perhaps you can have even lower unemployment than that. It's always going to be very, very difficult difficult to get 0% unemployment by definition, because there will always be some workers who are moving from job to job. However, it's pretty important in the economy to try and reduce the natural rate of unemployment. We think maybe in France the natural rate of employment may be much higher. Let's say the natural rate of unemployment in France is at 10%. Now what that means is you cannot reduce unemployment below 10%, because if you do, then you're going to get inflation. So why would it be so much higher in France than it is in the UK? And the reason why it will be is simply because maybe France has much higher welfare payments. It's much harder for French firms to employ workers because they've got to employ them on a full-time contract for a year. So therefore the natural rate of unemployment is much, much higher. And that is really a failing of the French economy. Now, clearly in Asia or in China in particular, the natural rate of unemployment may well be at about 1%. And that is because if you lose your job in China, you're going to get very little in terms of welfare benefits. So therefore it creates a situation of people where people really, really want to work. And if they really want to work, then they're going to accept low wages because it's far better than being unemployed. But once again, the main message of all of this is supply side economics. So I've got down here, if you reduce the unemployment rate below 5%, then this will increase inflation because there's a shortage of workers on the labour market. So then those workers will then ask for higher wages. So how can we reduce the natural rate of unemployment? Well, by the usual supply side methods. Reducing income tax, reducing welfare benefits, that's going to increase incentive to go out to work. More training, so workers have more skills. Decrease corporation tax, firms will have more money to invest, so therefore they'll employ more workers. Reducing the power of the trade unions, that will reduce wages, so therefore firms are more likely to employ workers. 0-hour contracts, it makes it more likely therefore that firms will employ people because they can get rid of them very, very quickly. Privatisation, firms have to survive by the profit motive to keep their shareholders happy, so therefore they won't employ excess amounts of workers. And also free trade, we then start competing with other countries like China and South Korea. Therefore they can produce goods more cheaply. So therefore in this country we can't afford to pay the high wages because the Chinese wages are so much lower. Now if we take the European market as a whole, we have a lot of labour rigidity in the European market compared to Asia, which has suddenly become very, very big in the last 30 odd years. So then we move on to Friedman's theory, which sort of sounds a little bit silly really, but let's learn this particular one. Now basically what he's saying is if we start off at point A and we try and reduce unemployment, so we go further in here, we can do that, but in the short run there will be a trade-off between higher inflation and lower unemployment. So these workers will then be offered higher wages, so there will be a nominal rise in their incomes of say 5%. That will attract those workers to position B. However, in reality what happens is, although they're getting 5% more in nominal terms, they haven't realised that inflation has also gone up to 5%. So in the short run they're suffering from money illusion. They do not understand that money is now worth less. However, once they realise that in real terms their wages haven't increased at all, they will then withdraw themselves from the labour market and will end up at point C. That is his theory. That's what you write about in an exam. However, the most important part of that theory is that we can shift the long run Phillips curve inwards to here. And if we can shift the long run Phillips curve inwards, then we reduce the natural rate of unemployment. If we can then reduce the natural rate of unemployment, so say in France that the natural rate of employment is 10% and they reduce it to 5%, that therefore then means they can run the economy at high levels of demand without creating inflation. So a key part of the economics therefore is to try and shift the long run Phillips curve inwards, and you do that through all of these supply side measures. Now I know the students find this concept very, very difficult, but in fact if you keep it at this level, it's actually very, very simple. Everything is about supply side economics. These here are clearly supply side policies. All of those will increase the supply of labour or increase the demand for labour. So therefore that will reduce the natural rate of unemployment. It's all about giving the structural workers and the frictional workers the right skills so that therefore they can find jobs. We want to try and create the natural rate, we want to try and make the natural rate of unemployment as low as possible, because if you can make it as low as possible, that means you can run the economy at high levels of demand without creating inflation. Why is that? Because if you reduce the level of unemployment by too much, then suddenly workers will suddenly ask for higher wages, which will then go on to create inflation. Then we have this piece of theory that was put forward by Friedman. He eventually changed that theory slightly. So this is the theory, this is the money illusion one. But what he then said was that all workers would realise that when you suddenly increase demand in the economy, that therefore their wages wouldn't actually go up, because therefore there would be inflation. So we would move directly from A to C. The natural rate of employment, the definition of it is either structural and frictional unemployed, or it's when the demand for labour and the supply of labour is in equilibrium. We want to try and reduce that inwards, but when we're at this point here, the natural rate of employment, we can also call that the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment, because if we are at this line here or further to the right of this line, then inflation will not take off. The old Phillips curve, finally I finished with, the old Phillips curve is now a little bit out of date. There is a certain amount of truth in it, obviously, that if we reduce unemployment too far, then we will get higher inflation. But through supply side economics, it's possible to shift the long run Phillips curve inwards. And therefore it is possible in theory, and actually in reality as well, that if you have the right supply side economics, we can also reduce inflation. And if we do take the year 2014, interestingly, we have now got lower inflation in the last year, and that's mainly due to cost push factors from abroad, but we've also got lower unemployment, which totally conflicts with this curve. End of this lesson.